This is Mount Moriah. Over the past 4,000 years, this hallowed ground has embraced the rise and fall of 2 altars, 3 temples, and 2 shrines, each layer a testament to the enduring spirit of faith and devotion. It was here that King Solomon erected the first temple, a magnificent structure that succumbed to the flames of Babylonian conquest. The temple's ashes gave rise to a second glory under Zerubbabel, only to meet its demise once again at the hands of the Romans in AD 70. The destruction, particularly poignant on the 9th of Erv, echoes through time as a day of deep mourning. To this day, visitors can be seen weeping over the ruins, their grief as palpable as though the calamity occurred almost 2,000 years ago. Mount Moriah's sanctity has shielded it from the touch of the archaeological spade, preserving its mysteries beneath an untouched veil. Yet, even without the diggers' intervention, the site brims with evidence of its storied past. Our journey begins by tracing the biblical narratives that chronicle the mountain's profound legacy. As we weave historical facts with archaeological finds, the true essence of Mount Moriah's location emerges with undeniable clarity, standing as a beacon of ancient truths and everlasting devotion. In Genesis 22 verse 2, God presents Abraham with a heart-wrenching command: to take his beloved son Isaac to the region of Moriah and offer him as a burnt sacrifice on a designated mountain. Obedient yet heavy-hearted, Abraham and Isaac ascend the slopes of Mount Moriah with only the materials for the ritual, fire and a knife, but no lamb for the sacrifice. As they walk, Isaac becomes puzzled and asks his father about the lamb for the offering. Abraham responds with unwavering faith, God himself will provide the lamb. Upon reaching the summit that God had specified, Abraham constructs an altar, binds Isaac upon it, and prepares to complete the sacrifice. However, just as Abraham raises the knife, an angel intervenes, calling from heaven to spare the boy. In that moment, Abraham notices a ram entangled by its horns in a nearby thicket. He seizes this God-sent opportunity, using the ram as a substitute for his son. This act, where the ram is sacrificed in place of Isaac, illustrates a powerful theme of substitutionary sacrifice, a life given so another could be spared. In a compelling sequence of biblical history, we find a link between sacrifices that shape the destiny of a nation. In 2 Samuel 24, a grave sin by King David triggers a devastating plague upon Israel. In a moment of despair, as David watches an angel wreak havoc among the people, he confesses his sin to the Lord. To make amends, David is instructed to construct an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. After purchasing the site and the necessary oxen, David builds the altar and offers burnt sacrifices. Miraculously, as the smoke rises, the plague ceases, again illustrating the theme of substitutionary sacrifice, where the oxen perish so the people of Israel might survive. King David harbored a profound aspiration to construct a temple as a sacred residence for the Ark of the Covenant, transitioning from the transient tabernacle employed since Moses' era. Despite his fervent intentions, divine counsel relayed through the prophet Nathan directed otherwise. In the scriptures, particularly 1 Chronicles 22 and 28, it is stated that God appreciated David's devotion, but decreed that he was not to build the temple. This task was destined for his son Solomon, whose era of peace contrasted with David's tenure, marked by extensive warfare. God specified that the sanctity of the temple required a foundation of peace, not one tainted by the bloodshed of war. Thus, Solomon's peaceful reign was deemed the perfect backdrop for erecting this hallowed structure. This place of sacrifice, laden with profound historical significance, is further illuminated in 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1. Solomon, following in his father David's footsteps, chooses this very site on Mount Moriah to construct the temple of the Lord. This site, initially marked by Abraham's obedience in nearly sacrificing his son Isaac, becomes the ground where Solomon's temple would stand, continuing the legacy of divine encounters and sacrificial offerings. The connection of these sacred events is pinpointed to Mount Moriah, the same location where Abraham, David, and later Solomon each engaged in pivotal acts of faith. This mountain, therefore, transcends its physicality, representing a continuum of faith, sacrifice, and divine intervention across generations. Solomon's temple, built to honor these traditions, was designed as a place where sacrifices were made to seek favor and forgiveness from God. underscoring the enduring sanctity and purpose of this ancient site. In 2 Kings 25 verse 9, the Babylonians set fire to the temple of the Lord, the one place that the Israelites were allowed to offer their atoning sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins. The temple had been destroyed, and the people had been exiled. When they were allowed to come back from exile by the decree of Cyrus, the first thing that they wanted to do was to go back to Jerusalem, back to the ruins of the temple, and rebuild the temple and reinstitute the sacrificial system. Ezra chapter 6 says that King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices. Let the governor of the Jews rebuild this house of God on it, its site, and repair its ruins. We learn in Ezra that the exiles, when they returned to Jerusalem, they weren't doing a new thing. They weren't building a temple in a brand new place. What they were doing is they were rebuilding the temple on its spot. This means that they built the second temple on the same spot that the first temple had previously stood. And that's why it also describes the rebuilding of the second temple as repair, carrying the ruins of the first temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. By the 1st century, AD historian Josephus wrote, Herod the Great started to enlarge the temple. He didn't build a different temple in a different location. He took the temple that was already standing and simply enlarged and glorified it. And this was the temple that was standing on the Temple Mount at the time of Jesus. This is Herod's Temple Mount. This is the very temple which was witnessed by Jesus. After Jesus' crucifixion in Jerusalem in the year 33 of the Common Era, the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans following the First Revolt, which started in 66 of the Common Era. 4 years later, in the year 70 CE, the temple got burned down by the soldiers of Titus, and after the battles ended, Titus, his army, and his engineering forces intentionally ruined the entire city of Jerusalem, as well as the focal point of Jerusalem, which is the Temple Mount, the heart, soul, and spirit of Jerusalem. In the year AD 130, the Roman Emperor Hadrian built a shrine on top of the Temple Mount. Jerome, a historian, wrote, "In the place where once there was the temple, there was set up a statue of Hadrian and an idol of Jupiter. The site where the temple stood had been desecrated." And we have the historian Jerome as an eyewitness, seeing this shrine that Hadrian had built with 2 statues, one of Hadrian and one of Jupiter. During the Christian portion of the Roman Empire, called the Byzantine period, the Temple Mount remained bare. There were no buildings on it. The Byzantines, who built churches just about everywhere, did not build a church on this site. But we are given the reason why from a historical source, where the Bishop of Jerusalem says the reason that they didn't build a church on the Temple Mount is because of the prophecy of Jesus, when he was speaking of the buildings on top of the Temple Mount, that there wouldn't be a stone left on top of a stone. And so, this is the reason that the Christians in the Byzantine period did not build a church on this sacred site. In AD 638, the Muslim Caliph Umar came into and took over Jerusalem, and he asked the Bishop of Jerusalem to give him a place which he might build a sanctuary. And the bishop responded, "It is the rock on which the temple for the Israelites." Then a little bit later, in AD 692, another caliph named Abdu al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock, but it's important to understand that the Dome of the Rock marks the location. It was chosen as a location for where previously the first and second temple had stood over the course of thousands of years on top of Mount Moriah. And on this specific place we have where Abraham built an altar, where David built an altar, where Solomon built the temple, where Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, where Herod enlarged the temple, where Hadrian built a shrine, and where the Islamic Caliph Abdu al-Malik built the Islamic shrine that has marked the location of where these pre-building projects over 1300 years were located. With the latest evidence and working our way back through time, the Dome of the Rock takes us from the present back to AD 692. Located just to the north of the Western Wall, the Prayer Hall. The Dome of the Rock was built under large arches built by Hadrian around AD 130 to give access to the shrine that he constructed on top of Moriah. There is a pile of stones that came from the buildings that stood on top of the Temple Mount. These buildings were destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 and pushed off the Temple Mount platform. The masonry of the western and southern Temple Mount walls dates to the time of Herod. The great Herod extended the western and southern sides of the Temple Mount platform that already existed you can still see a seam in the masonry that identifies the place where Herod's extension began. The masonry south of the seam is Herod's addition north of the seam. Some of the masonry belonging to Zerubbabel's Temple Mount still remains. The steps leading up to Herod's temple are the original steps here, and some restoration of the steps, which is dramatic evidence of the Babylonian destruction. The rock peak of Mount Moriah is the oldest physical evidence which is hidden today beneath the Dome of the Rock. This is the rock that the Dome of the Rock is named after. Despite the fact that the Temple Mount itself has not been excavated, there is plenty of visible evidence from all the periods from the various events that happened on Jerusalem's Holy Hill. The Temple Mount is a place under very high political tension. Upon entry, you must take a security briefing by a police officer. This place has 12 non-sealed gates, but most of them allow only Muslims to enter. Non-Muslim visitors can only enter through one gate. It is called Bab al-Magharbe, or in English, the Gate of the Moors. And what makes things even more difficult is you can only enter this gate only on certain days. The entry is via Moors Gate, the only gate through which visitors can enter. Israel, Jordan, and the Islamic Waqif control the Temple Mount. It is a joint operation. The Temple Mount is policed by the State of Israel. However, the daily administration of things is managed by the Islamic Waqf, which is primarily sponsored by Jordan. The Temple Mount is large. It is the largest religious compound of the ancient world. It is so big that it occupies 1/6 of the entire old city of Jerusalem. And even though the Temple Mount looks like a platform, back in the time of David, it was just a mound upon which it is believed Solomon built the first temple. And at the time, the platform was not large. But with years, it had undergone numerous expansions, with the largest of them being done by King Herod in the 1st century BC, as he erected giant walls around the mound and filled them with earth. And as a result, a giant flat platform was formed. The dating is scattered all over the place because there had been so many reconstructions done here throughout the ages. The 8 arch structures that surround the Dome of the Rock were built in the early Islamic period, most of them dating to about the 8th century AD. The Dome of the Rock was built at the end of the 7th century during the early Islamic reign, and it is one of the most recognized buildings in the entire world. If you pay close attention to its structure, you will notice that it does not look like a mosque. And that is because, originally, it was not built as a mosque. It was built as a shrine to the foundation stone of the temple, the stone which is located at the center of this building. The Supreme Muslim Council, led by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, published a guide to the Temple Mount in 1924, in which they write that its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. And they even continue to say that this is where David built an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And this so-called foundation stone, upon which it is believed Abraham was sent to sacrifice his son Isaac, and where David built an altar, could also be the same stone upon which the Ark of the Covenant once stood. According to a famous archaeological architect and researcher, Leon Rittmeyer, who discovered the evidence for the location of Solomon's temple, we may still see the depression in the bedrock marking the place where the Ark of the Covenant would have been settled in to prevent it from moving. Only Muslim worshippers can go in. Since excavations are prohibited at this site, archaeologists have to primarily rely on data recorded during renovations. In 1951, when the floor was replaced at the Dome of the Rock, archaeologists recorded remains of ancient walls that are believed to date to the Second Temple period and possibly be the remains of the base of the temple walls. Under this rock, there is a cave called Well of the Souls, where Muslim worshippers may enter to pray. Not much is known about the origins of the cave due to the strict no excavation rules. However, in 2015, when the carpets were replaced, the floor of the cave was documented on camera for the first time in human history. The images sent shockwaves around the world as people started speculating what these peculiar designs might be. Some even suggesting that this could be a clue to the location of the lost Ark of the Covenant, a theory that was born due to the discovery made by Ermete Pierotti in the 19th century. He wrote that there is an additional cave underneath the Well of the Souls, and he said that he was able to reach this cave through a secret tunnel. The Golden Gate. This is the gate that you see from the Mount of Olives, and it is hard to miss because it is the only gate on the eastern wall. The Golden Gate, also known as the Eastern Gate, or in Hebrew, Sha'ar Harachamim. The Gate of Mercy is the most interesting gate of all on the Temple Mount. All three major monotheistic religions place a huge significance on this gate. Some Jews believe this is the gate through which the Messiah will come in accordance to Ezekiel's prophecy. The Muslims believe this gate is connected to the final judgment at the end of days, while the Christians believe this is the gate through which Jesus the Messiah had already entered, riding on the donkey, fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies, and will come back again during the second coming, entering this gate in the last days. Why is this gate sealed? After the gate had been sealed by the Arabs in the 9th century, then opened up by the Crusaders and sealed again by Saladin, it had been shut since the medieval times. And here's the reason why. It is said that the Muslim rulers did not want the Jewish prophecies to come about and a false Messiah to come through the gate. So they not only shut it, but the Ottomans placed a cemetery in front of it to also prevent Elijah, the forerunner to the Messiah, from coming through the gate because the cemetery would defile him in accordance to the Jewish law. Today, the gate is used for Muslim worshippers, so visitor entry is forbidden. However, from the outside, we can see some incredible traces of history. Even though most of the structure of the gate is believed to date to the Byzantine or early Islamic period, there is something spectacular lying on the ground level. In the 70s, Leon Rittmeyer was given access to spend a whole week inside the gate. During this week, he documented the interior surfaces and was able to see two monolithic gateposts that seem to date to the First Temple period. These gateposts lie perfectly in line with the Iron Age masonry of the Eastern Wall. And this First Temple masonry can still be seen from the outside of the walls today for anybody who passes by. If all this indeed checks out, then today's Eastern Gate is built right on top of the original First Temple Gate, called the Shushan Gate, the same gate that would have been reserved only for the high priest and those who aided him taking out the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement. The Al-Aqsa Mosque has incredible history hiding right under its floors. In 1927, a major earthquake shook the region, taking down the rooftop of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. To prevent future collapse, the Waqif decided to strengthen the foundations by digging up the floors around the supporting columns. And when they lifted the floors, a British archaeologist, Robert Hamilton, was on site to document the work in case they found something underneath. And to no surprise, so many things were found that Hamilton wrote a 336-page report in which he documents ancient structures, marble floors, underground passages, and so much more. But one of the most incredible findings was a mosaic that lies underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque floor. This mosaic did not get much attention until a prominent Israeli archaeologist, Zaki Devira, noticed it is almost identical in pattern to the mosaic found in the Church of Nativity. And even though some say the early Muslims used to mimic the Byzantine style, this mosaic stretched to the outside of the original mosque. If so, then there was an earlier building under the Al-Aqsa, possibly a Byzantine church. And even more intriguing is that when Devira was looking through the archives, he noticed that one of the staircases they dug out has a divider which is very similar to the one a Jewish ritual bath would have, a mikveh. During the renovations, the wooden support beams were removed. These support beams were then taken to be tested using carbon dating method and dendrochronological dating, a very precise method for dating trees. The results were nothing short of astonishing. The beams are cypress trees and cedars of Lebanon, and some of the beams dated to the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus, while a few of the beams dated to the First Temple period, the time of David and Solomon. In Mark 13, as Jesus was leaving the temple with his disciples, they said to him, "What massive stones! What magnificent buildings! Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus replied, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." At the time of Jesus, the two magnificent buildings that were on top of the Temple Mount were of course the temple itself, and Jesus spoke of these buildings that not one stone would be left on top of another, they all would be cast down. That's exactly what happened to the buildings up there. Just as Jesus prophesied, they were destroyed, not one stone was left on top of another, they all were cast down off the Temple Mount and came crashing down on the Roman streets. This street level here is an amazing archaeological evidence for the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. The evidence speaks for itself. The prophecy came through the temple, and the entire city of Jerusalem was brutally destroyed by Titus in the year 70 of the Common Era. The destruction was intentional, pre-planned, and not a single building of Jerusalem was left, and not a stone upon the stone of the temple remained. There is proximity between two events that we have in the Bible. The first is what happens on Mount Moriah, where Abraham comes up and builds an altar and then offers Isaac on that altar, but is provided a substitutionary sacrifice with a ram caught in the thickets. He sacrifices that ram in place of his son Isaac, which is marked by the Dome of the Rock. At the right of the Dome of the Rock, there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The silver dome on the top of the church marks the place of Jesus' crucifixion, the place where God provided a substitutionary sacrifice in the Lamb of God, the Son of God, and that is where he died for the sins of man. In John chapter 2, Jesus went up to Jerusalem in the temple courts, Jesus, and said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days." But the temple he had spoken of was his body. What Jesus is claiming is that his body is the superior temple that will provide the superior atonement. In the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah 53, the Israelite prophet Isaiah is prophesying about the coming of a person, this Messiah, and he calls him a suffering servant, and he says that the iniquity of us all will be laid on him, that he will be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and that he will be cut off from the land of the living. And then he says this, "The Lord makes his life an offering for sin, which is substitutionary sacrifice." The Messiah would die instead of us. This is why John the Baptist in John 1 verse 29 saw Jesus coming and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. This is the one Isaiah spoke of in Isaiah 53. This is the one who will become a sin offering on our behalf." We know that Jesus didn't die on Mount Moriah. In Hebrews 13:12, the Bible makes it very clear that Jesus suffered outside the city gate. Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem, but at the moment that he died, it affected a specific place, and that place was inside the city. A place was on top of Mount Moriah, and that place was inside the temple itself. Matthew chapter 27 says that when Jesus gave up his spirit at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn into two from top to bottom. The sacrifice of Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, which is why when the curtain was ripped from top to bottom, it allowed man who has now been forgiven of sin to enter the Holy of Holies, which is the very presence of God, where we can enter into an intimate relationship with God, both in this life and the life that is to come. And there's just one way. It is through the blood of Jesus.